Welcome to another edition of Our City. Keep in mind that residents can visit our social media sites, get more information on anything going on in the city of Elizabeth, or if you need information on COVID testing or the Elizabeth vaccine, just go to elizabethnjvaccine.org to schedule. Keep in mind, while the numbers of COVID are way down, personal responsibility is extremely important. If you need any more information, simply have a question. If you're ill, just call the Public Information Office at 908-820-4124. And for this week's show, we're going to discuss regional climate change and a resiliency discussion. And I'm pleased to be joined by Ms. Katie Boicourt, who is the Environmental Defense Fund and also the Director of Climate Resilience Coast and Watershed. Kate, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
And also joined by Mr. Tyler Taba, sorry, run that together, it's happened to you before, I'm sure, who's the Senior Manager for Climate Policy and the Waterfront Alliance. Tyler, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much.
So, Kate, you've been on the show before. We did a Zoom last year, but if you don't mind going first, tell our audience a little bit about yourself, how you've come up through this organization, and the work that you do.
Sure. Well, actually, I think this is a really special show because I get to be here with Tyler, who's actually working at Waterfront Alliance, where I used to work. So I think that was probably the last time we came on. Was really.
Well, we did it by Zoom last time, Kate. So
maybe since then. But I work for Environmental Defense Fund now, and we work on sort of a mixture of science, economics, partnerships, and advocacy focused on climate change, so that we can have a vital earth for everyone. And one of the key things I work on is right here in New Jersey and New York on policy advocacy and research related to climate change and especially flooding.
So I know you have a passion for this, Kate. Did you go to school for this? Did you see yourself winding up in this type of field, or is this something kind of you morphed into?
I always thought I'd be working on science in some way. My dad is a scientist. Somehow the apple didn't fall far from the tree. I grew up on a coast, and I think I didn't know that I'd be working on climate change issues, but it's near and dear to me as a resident of this region, and also living up near the coast since I was a kid. So
right.
Very much, yeah.
So Tyler, tell us a little bit about yourself too.
Sure, yeah. So I'm at Waterfront Alliance. I'm the Senior Manager for Climate Policy, and I get to work with great people like Kate through the Rise to Resilience Coalition, which is a coalition that Waterfront Alliance spearheads. We're about 110 organizations spread out across New York and New Jersey, focused on making climate resilience an urgent policy priority. But a little bit more about Waterfront Alliance. We're also an advocacy and policy organization, bi-state focused. And so my role is really involved more on the resilience and adaptation policy, but we also do advocacy around urban planning and design, maritime and ports, environmental education, and open and public access to the waterfront. So it's really great.
So same question you that I asked Kate. Did you envision yourself going to college and winding up in this type of work?
Yeah, no, not really actually. I moved to New York City about 5.5 years ago to study environmental science.
From where?
From Dallas, from Texas. Yeah. So
there's a little culture shock for you?
A little culture shock, that's right. Yeah, I went to undergrad in Waco, so Waco to New York City was a big culture shock for sure. But I was always interested in water in a weird way, because you kind of have this lack of water in a lot of places in the world where there's drought, and then you have the abundance of water in places where there's flooding, and those two things kind of sometimes happen in the same place. And so I've always been a little bit fascinated by water. I started my first environmental job at the New York City Parks Department on stormwater management, and that's sort of how I dipped my feet into resilience and adaptation, and then went on to the National Parks Conservation Association, and now ended up here at Waterfront Alliance. So
Kate, tell us, the Environmental Defense Fund is an extremely important organization, but a lot of people don't know what it is. So tell us what exactly the Environmental Defense Fund is and what your role is there.
Yeah, so we're actually now a global organization, so we're actually...
Did it start here, by the way, Kate? Did it start in this neck of the woods?
It did. You have a good memory. Actually, it started originally by a group of scientists that were really upset about DDT, this chemical that was impacting birds and the bald eagles, actually.
Rachel
Carson wrote
right.
Silent Spring,
Silent
absolutely. And then this group of scientists really mobilized and started it out on Long Island. So it's very much started in this region. And today we have bald eagles nesting in parks around our neighborhoods, really. And that's a testament to what action can do when people get organized and use science, advocacy, partnerships, and a little bit of economics. And that's really what we do in many parts of the nation and the world. But I work right here in New York and New Jersey on a lot of
So, Kate, tell us, how does the Environmental Defense Fund get funded? How do you know, like there's some people who hope you go out of business is what I'm getting at. And there's others who really want to see your mission succeed. So how do you get funded?
So in the U.S., it's all donors, philanthropy, and that's kind of it. We can't take corporate sponsorships directly, so that's something we really focus on our members and donors and also philanthropic organizations.
So your role at the Waterfront Alliance, tell us about that.
Sure, yeah. So all things on resilience and adaptation, that sort of falls into my portfolio. So we're an advocacy organization, like I mentioned, so we're advocating for better legislation that's focused on resilience, better land use planning, more community work, grassroots organizing, and a lot of that is done. We're an alliance, it's in the name, so there's about 1,100 alliance partners, and then I mentioned the Rise to Resilience Coalition, which is sort of our main vehicle for advocacy, if you will, and so that's spread out across New York and New Jersey, so we get to work with a lot of great organizations, large national and regional organizations, but also small frontline grassroots organizations.
So why was that formed, the Rise to Resilience?
Sure, yeah, so I'll give a little bit of an overview, and then I can also have Kate chime in, because she was there for the formation of the coalition. But it was really formed, I think.
Kate's been there for the formation of everything.
I know, yeah, and it's
not that
old. So it was really born out of, I think, Hurricane Sandy, and there was all this sort of conversation in the early climate change movement about mitigation and renewable energy and greenhouse gases and all these things, but not so much on resilience and adaptation and what are the things that we can be doing right now to protect ourselves from some of the climate impacts that we're sort of locked into, right? I mean, decarbonization and emissions reductions are the most important things that we can do because that's how we stop all these negative impacts, but we're really baked into a certain amount of sea level rise, more extreme weather events, extreme heat. So what are the things that we can be doing in the short term and the medium term to make sure that people are protected, infrastructure is protected, and I think that's really what the Rise to Resilience Coalition was formed to get at, is to get ahead of the curve on resilience and adaptation. So we brought together, Waterfront Alliance brought together a bunch of different organizations across the region, not all environmental groups either, I should say. This is housing groups, labor, business, and really tried to form a diverse coalition behind resilience and adaptation to really make it and bring it into the mainstream. And so we've had some good successes. It was formed in 2020. I came on board about a year and a half ago. And so we spearhead it, but it's really a collaborative and collective effort. And I can let Kate kind of talk about the early formation of the coalition and that whole process.
I mean, I think you covered it. I think the only thing that I would really add is that it was built on a lot of consensus building, from grassroots to FEMA to state to local. And so there was actually a year-plus long consensus building process of what are the policies that need to change that then led to that formation of a coalition, because you can't do anything without a coalition, right? And that's really how it formed. And I'm thrilled to still be part of it and working with Tyler in a different role.
So you've explained to everyone involved in it. What about the challenges? I'm a politician. I see. Is that the biggest challenge, politics, or are there other challenges in this effort? What are the challenges? You want to go first? What are the challenges, Kate?
I think some of the challenges are, this is something that, reminding people that what we're trying to deal with is something that is already here. I think there is this perception that it is far off. It's 2100. It's a long time away, or that the solutions are too complex. And so I think what our job is to recognize that Hurricane Sandy, Hurricane Ida, these are problems we face today. You've experienced other storms besides those that have impacted Elizabeth and broader New Jersey and New York. And to try to make those, break down the problem and the solutions into parts so that we can tackle them one by one. And that's what we've been doing together, and that's the only way we're going to be able to dig out of it.
So the problems in substance you've just described, what about the problems from the political level? Do you get involved in that, or are you even allowed to comment on that? Or do you rather restrict your comments because of the politics?
No, I don't think so at all. I think we're pretty open. We're working on legislation. We're working on policy together. There definitely are political challenges, I would say. I think for a long time we were struggling with funding being a huge issue, but now we're starting to see historic levels of federal funding that are sort of dedicated toward resilience, and now we're facing a different problem, and that's the implementation of that funding, and how do we actually get that money down to communities and get shovels in the ground and build infrastructure and all those kinds of things, and do all of that with the framework and the lens of resiliency, which I don't think we've done really ever in the history. I mean, there's been examples, but I think a lot of the infrastructure and the building that we've done in the past hasn't really had an eye towards resilience and adaptation. So there's now this challenge of how do we do that, and how do we make sure that we're doing that in the right way and not exacerbating already inequitable outcomes that exist. I think a huge focus of the coalition is environmental justice and making sure that we're really putting those people and communities who are historically disadvantaged, who are low income, who are communities of color at the forefront. And infrastructure has really not done that in the past, or it's sort of divided between affluent and environmental justice and low income people. And so how do we make sure that now that we're getting funding and having this opportunity to rethink our infrastructure, we're not rewriting those wrongs, and we're sort of taking this as a way to move forward in a different way and rewrite them in a better and more positive way. So there's certainly a lot of challenges, and I think that's what we're trying to address. But we're seeing a lot of progress, and I'm optimistic that we'll move forward.
So Kate, Tyler mentioned environmental justice. Many in the business community feel environmental justice is just a roadblock, delays the plans, slows things up, right? So how do we convince others who are maybe not so susceptible to understanding that it's important for the future of society?
Well, I think Tyler did a really great job of laying out why exactly it's important. And I just will echo that, but also say it's practical. So if you're talking about the business community, we've seen several examples of projects fail and not move forward because of protests, because people were not listened to. And we actually, when I was working at Waterfront Alliance, we worked often at the intersection between communities, a developer, the city, or the states, and you'll find that if things actually slow down, and perhaps that even costs the public entities, the private entities, and frankly the public, if they're not listened to. And I think that's related to your larger political question. When you start getting into land use policies, which a lot of this intersects with, when we're talking about flooding and where people live and how we're building or not building and where, it's really, really controversial, and so everybody has to be listened to and add that to it.
No, because it's funny, not funny, but the way you say that, and looking at local planning opportunities here, you try to restrict as much macadam as possible in order to avoid a lot of runoff. And that may sound small compared to what all you folks do, but here in our city, that just increases the opportunities for more flooding. And so Elizabeth in New Jersey, we face a lot of issues when it comes to climate change in the cities you represent. I'm just curious, do you quantify the risk based on storms in the future if things are not done? You want to go for that, Tyler?
Yeah, I'm not sure I understand. Quantify the risk.
The risk to an Elizabeth or the risk to New Jersey, like if some of the climate changes you advocate for, if they're not done, then will things get worse for us?
Oh, okay, yes, absolutely, I think.
How do you quantify that in today's world to say, hey, 20 years, what it's going to look like?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there's a few things you could say here, so I'll try to be brief, but I think we've seen over time and time again that it pays actually to invest early and to invest in resilience. And even though it might be more expensive up front, let's say to add green infrastructure to a property, to protect it from flooding or elevating properties to a certain level, while that might be expensive in the now or in the short term, it actually saves you money in the long term. I think there's been some studies that even 6 to 1, if you build beyond code to some resilient standards, that you're actually saving yourself money in the long run. So there is some ways of quantifying it that way, but I think we've already seen some of the risks that are faced. To Kate's point, we're always thinking climate change 2050, 2100, but we're already sort of seeing it now, right? I mean, we've seen more extreme weather events. People always think to Sandy, but we've seen Ida and even unnamed storms that that are causing flooding on a more regular basis, and what that poses to transportation infrastructure, electricity and reliability of the grid, people's homes and flooding and lives lost. And so I don't know what the exact number would be, but I think there's definitely major risks if we don't start acting now. And New Jersey is actually taking on some of the most forward-thinking and progressive sort of stormwater building codes and elevation codes, and I think that's an ongoing process.
So what can local governments do?
Yeah, so I think just sort of, Tyler was talking about the individual property level, and I think this actually connects to your municipal tax base is often in the floodplain and out of it. So you're vulnerable too from a fiscal perspective as a city. So I think one of the things that you can do, and this is also a law that was passed in partnership with Rise to Resilience, is think about climate change in your master planning that you're doing as a city. And think about what are the policies and zoning changes that we can think about in advance, and what are the ways that we can get those programs, that federal money, where it needs to go to try to reduce the risk of that exposure we've already got. But I do think also thinking about the source of the money being tied to our flood times is a risk that we need to think about from a fiscal perspective.
So before we close, talk about some of your accomplishments in each of your organizations and some of the things you think you can accomplish in the near future, because I think what you said earlier about 2100 or 2150, it's hard for people to grasp. Yeah. And they're all like, we got plenty of time for that. So talk about some of the short-term accomplishments and what do you think you can do in the next couple of years?
Yeah, sure. I can go quickly first. So one is a recent victory that I think I'd be remiss if I didn't mention, and that's just last week the New Jersey state legislature passed the flood risk disclosure legislation, and that's going to be one of the strongest flood risk disclosure laws in the country. So for folks who might not know, this is now a law, if signed by Governor Murphy, that would require home sellers and landlords to disclose any prior flood damages that have occurred on a property in the past. And there's also a piece in there about looking at a future flood map and seeing if your property is at risk of flooding in the future. And that's really important because purchasing a home or renting a home or where you call your home is one of the most important decisions you make in your life, and so you should go into that really with the best informed information to make that decision. And so New Jersey just became the 30th state to pass that legislation, and so we're really, really happy about that. There's no way to have access to prior flood damages otherwise, so flood risk disclosure is a really important way of communicating climate information in a transparent way and in an awareness-building way for people to make informed decisions. And then I would say for the future, looking on, what we're hoping to do is we've all been working together collectively on the Army Corps of Engineers, New York and New Jersey Harbor and Tributary Study, and so we want to see big money coming into the region and building resilient infrastructure to protect us from all these sort of different risks that we're talking about. And so we've all been working together on the public comment period, and I'm hopeful that we'll see a good project move forward in the coming years as a result of that.
Kate, some closing comments?
Yeah, I think I'm really excited about our organization was really involved in the Inflation Reduction Act, which is a big lot of federal money that's going to give us a little bit of hope in terms of investments in climate change. And I really want to say that it's the little things that we can do, or also just make sure we're aware of weather and keeping on top of knowing what our risks are and where we sit in relation to those flood risks. So those are things that you can do in your home, as well as plan for emergencies and get engaged with the city. And just really thank you for taking the time to focus on this important issue.
Kate, I want to thank you for your work, and every year you take the time to join us on this show and brief the residents of our city on the important issues of the Environmental Defense Fund, and before that, the Water Alliance. And Tyler, it's nice to meet you, and I thank you for coming here as well to talk this evening. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
For Miss Katie Boicourt and Mr. Tyler Taba, I'm Mayor Chris Bollwage. We'll see you next week on another edition of Our City.